Hello everyone. In the previous chapters, we learned together about the abnormal phenomena and causes of the circuit breakers. Do you want to know how to deal with the abnormalities of the circuit breaker that occur in the operation of the power grid? Next, let's learn it together. First, the handling of circuit breaker refusing to open. If a circuit breaker in the operation fails to open, it must be immediately shut down. The specific method is to use a bypass circuit breaker in parallel with the abnormal circuit breaker, and use an isolation switch to break the loop and power off the abnormal circuit breaker, or use a bus-tie circuit breaker in series with the abnormal circuit breaker. When the bus-tie circuit breaker is disconnected, then use the isolation switches on both sides of the abnormal circuit breaker to power off the abnormal circuit breaker. The key point here is the equipotential. As shown in the figure, the handling of Huyan Line 2 refusal to open can be achieved by using a bypass circuit breaker in parallel with the abnormal circuit breaker, and then opening the 2163 and 2161 isolation switches to power off the abnormal circuit breaker. Alternatively, the first section of the 220 kV bus bar load can be first reversed to the second section of the bus bar, and then the bus bar circuit breaker can be connected in series with the abnormal circuit breaker. After disconnecting the 231 bus bar circuit breaker, the isolation switches on both sides of the abnormal circuit breaker can be used to power off the abnormal circuit breaker. For the 3/2 connected circuit breaker, all adjacent circuit breakers must be disconnected before the isolation switches on both sides of the circuit breaker can be disconnected. If necessary, it is possible to directly open the isolation switches on both sides of the circuit breaker to open the loop. When direct pulling the knife switch, at least the control fuse of this series of switches should be disconnected. When the bus bar circuit breaker refusing to open, it is possible to simultaneously close the double switch of a certain component, which creates an equipotential condition. After switching one bus bar to standby, the bus bar circuit breaker can be powered off. As shown in the figure, if the 5012 circuit breaker refuses to open, the 5011 circuit breaker and the 5013 circuit breaker should be opened before the knife switches on the both sides of the 5012 circuit breaker can be opened. As shown in the figure, when the 231 circuit breaker refuses to open, the second section of the 220 kV bus bar or the first section of the 222 kV bus bar can be reversed into an empty bus bar, and then open the 2311 and 2312 knife switches to cut off the power of the bus tie current breaker. When the circuit breaker fails to close and the on-site personnel cannot identify the cause, the circuit breaker needs to be transferred for maintenance and treatment. If conditions permit, the equipment should be sent out using a bypass belt method. When the bus tie circuit breaker running on double bus bars stealthily trips and refuses to close, it is not possible to directly close the double knife switch of a certain component at the same time. The two bus bars must be operated in a closed loop through a bypass circuit breaker. Next, the handling of non-full phase operation of the circuit breaker is as follows. During the operation of the circuit breaker by on-site personnel, if the circuit breaker is not fully open, the circuit breaker should be opened by yourself. When the non-full phase occurs in a running circuit breaker, and if the two phases of the circuit breaker have already been disconnected at this time, the on-site personnel should be instructed to disconnect the 3 phases of the circuit breaker. If one phase of the circuit breaker is disconnected, the on-site personnel can try to close it once. If the closing is not successful, measures should be taken as soon as possible to cut off the power of the circuit breaker. In addition, if the circuit breaker trips or stealthily due to the personnel's accidental touch, misoperation or mechanical external vibration, etc., the power should be immediately transmitted after identifying the cause. Finally, let's review and summarize through 3 questions together. How to handle the circuit breaker refusal to open. How to handle the circuit breaker refusal to close. How to deal with non-full phase operation of the circuit breakers. That's all for this lesson. Thank you.